Welcome to the deep dive. You've brought us some absolutely fascinating source material today. It's based on a book looking into the early history, the nature of the deity we usually call Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
And it really focuses on how our understanding, or their understanding, of this figure evolved over, well, centuries.
Yeah, and our mission here is to unpack the, frankly, surprising insights in this material. It really challenges some common assumptions, about the divine.
Right.
And it sets the biblical picture of God firmly in its ancient cultural setting, which is crucial.
So expect some surprising facts, maybe. Some very human-like qualities we don't often think about.
Definitely. And how these big ideas about God shifted pretty dramatically over time.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The core idea, the big one, is that this deity, the one in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
people originally thought he had a body, a physical body.
That's the core argument, yeah. Corporeal, human-shaped, masculine. And the source traces his early career, let's say.
Early career.
Right from the late Bronze, early Iron Age, up to maybe the 6th century CE. And it asks why. Why did this deity get sort of disembodied culturally, theologically?
To become the God concept we mostly know today.
Exactly, that more abstract idea.
And the source material structures this by going through an anatomy of God, looking at the body parts.
It does, yeah. It uses that framework to explore descriptions, actions in the text that point to this physical body.
Okay, so if a God has a body,
Mm-hmm.
that means physical needs, right? Like humans.
That's the immediate implication, needs and functions.
Like needing to eat.
Food and sacrifice is a prime example. In the ancient world, sacrifice wasn't really about giving something up, not primarily. It was fundamentally about feeding the gods, serving them, and through that, building these really intense social relationships with them.
So Yahweh needed food. He wanted sacrifices.
That's the picture painted, yes. He desired sacrifices. And the source even mentions him liking the pleasing smell.
The smell, like barbecue.
Sort of. The smell of the offerings. Incense, for instance, is described almost like a garnish for the divine meal.
Wow.
Okay.
But this changed.
It did shift later, yeah. Especially after the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. You couldn't do sacrifices the same way.
Nah, practical reasons influencing theology.
Exactly. So the theology adapted. There's a psalm written later that reflects this. It says Yahweh doesn't need sacrifices because, well, the whole world is his pantry, basically.
Okay, but hang on. What about those bits in the Bible, like in Amos or Isaiah, where God seems to hate sacrifices? How does that fit?
That's a really good point. The material clarifies those passages usually have a very specific context. It's often not about sacrifice itself.
No.
No, it's more about condemning the insincerity of the offerings, like rich people making offerings while they're, oppressing the poor.
So it's a social justice thing mixed with the ritual.
Exactly. A strong social justice message right alongside the ritual concerns.
Okay, that makes more sense. What about other bodily things? Rest, effort, Sabbath comes up.
Right. Yes, the Sabbath. Rest for the worshipers, sure, but maybe. Maybe for the deity, too. The number 7 was hugely significant, in ancient Southwest Asia for timekeeping.
Older than the Bible.
Oh, millennia older. And there's this one verse in Exodus describing creation. It's pretty startling.
What does it say?
It says Yahweh needed to catch his breath on the 7th day.
Catch his breath.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah, and the source points out the Hebrew word used is the same one you'd use for, like, a laborer who's done hard physical work and needs to recover.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
incredibly human. Almost companionable. God getting winded after making the universe.
It really is. It suggests a physical effort, doesn't it? And beyond needs like food and rest, the divine actions in these early views often mirrored human actions.
Like making humans from clay. I know that story.
Right, but the idea itself wasn't unique to Genesis at all. It was super common across the ancient Near East.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Sumerian myths have gods like Enki and Ninmah doing it, making clay humans to work the temples and farms. Ugaritic texts mention the god El making a goddess from clay. Yeah.
And Egypt, too.
Yep, the god Kum, the potter god, shown crafting living things on a potter's wheel. Clay was seen as the primal stuff of life.
So the Genesis story is just one version of a very old theme.
Pretty much. The source argues it sets the biblical story in that much older, wider tradition, which challenges, claims of its total uniqueness.
Okay, this next one feels even more out there. The material talks about Yahweh having children. That seems worlds away from later ideas.
It does, doesn't it? But the material explores how Yahweh is portrayed as both a fertility god and a father figure.
How so?
Well, take Genesis 4.1. Eve's line is usually translated, I have gotten a man with the help of Yahweh.
Right.
But the Hebrew, according to the source, could more directly mean, I have created or procreated a man with Yahweh.
Whoa. Implying direct involvement.
It hints at a possible backstory, maybe lost or suppressed, where Yahweh actually fathered Cain with Eve.
That's radical reading.
Are there clearer examples?
There are others. The figure of wisdom in Proverbs is described as being born from his wet breath.
And there's some really powerful old poetry in Deuteronomy. It depicts Yahweh looking after this child, Jeshurun, in the wilderness, gazing at him like the little man in his eyes.
You mean the reflection in the pupil?
Exactly. It's presented as this incredibly tender, intimate parental moment, a very physical, close connection.
So this anatomy goes into a lot of specific body parts mentioned.
Oh yeah, it goes into detail. Feet, arms, face, innards, chest, hands, legs. And the source material is quite direct about things like genitals, too, especially relating to ancient fertility concepts.
Faces seem really important. Wanting to see God's face, but being afraid to.
Absolutely. That tension is there. Moses only seeing God's back, for example. And the source connects this deep human focus on faces to things like the Neolithic Jericho skulls.
The plastered skulls, those are ancient.
Over 9,500 years old. Exhumed skulls, plastered, reshaped to look like faces, set up to sit up. It's like trying to come face to face with something otherworldly.
And that relates to how we imagine gods.
The idea is it reflects how vital faces are for humans, recognizing social beings. Cognitive science of religion suggests that might be part of why we tend to imagine gods in human form. It's deep-seated.
And you mentioned the source is blunt about other aspects of divine physicality.
It mirrors the ancient perspective, which could be very earthy. Ancient myths often depict high gods with, well, potent physicality, linked to power, fertility.
Like the Eucharitic myth you mentioned.
Right, the one about the god El. There's a scene where he performs a masturbation act that impresses two goddesses who then conceive. The source points out this is a common motif. Fertility gods having notable generative power symbolized physically.
Wow. Okay. And this ties into the rainbow. How?
Well, the rainbow in the Genesis flood story usually seen as a promise, right?
Yeah.
But the source notes it can also be read as God's war bow, hung up after the battle against chaos, essentially.
Or bro.
Yeah. And in some ancient myths, like Marduk defeating Tiamat, the god's war bow is sometimes paralleled with his penis. Both symbols of ferocious, potent masculinity, both penetrative weapons in different senses.
Conquering enemies and generating life.
Exactly. Symbols of power. And the source even draws a line to modern time.
It does.
Yeah, pointing to leaders engaging in, let's say, symbolic boasting in a military context, like talking about the size of their nuclear buttons, a similar kind of masculine power display.
Right, okay. Shifting slightly. Jacob wrestling with God, or a divine being. That's a famous story.
Very famous. Set in this dangerous liminal place by a river at night, and the injury Jacob gets.
The hip.
The source notes the divine figure basically goes for the ghoulies, targets the hip joint, the socket. It's surprisingly specific and visceral.
Yikes. Okay. Moving on to something maybe less visceral, but still surprising, the idea Yahweh might have actually had a statue. A cult statue.
The material argues it's probable, yeah, that Yahweh likely had a cult statue in the Jerusalem temple early on. Maybe not huge, but present.
What's the evidence for that?
Things like mentions of the vessels of Yahweh being captured by enemies on inscriptions like the Mesha Stikol and in the Bible itself. That term likely included key cult objects, possibly a statue.
And the source highlights a really derogatory term used for the statues of other gods.
Oh, yeah. The word often translated idols in the Greek Bible is from a Hebrew word, jelulim. It literally means, well, dung pellets. Rolled up poo.
Seriously, shit gods.
That's the blunt translation the source uses, yeah. You find it especially in later texts like Ezekiel, priestly writings. It was deliberate debasement.
Because the statue wasn't just a symbol, it was where the god was.
Exactly. The deity was understood to manifest in the statue, so calling rival statues dung was a powerful insult. The source even mentions Elijah taunting Baal's prophets.
Right, asking if their god is busy.
Yeah, asking if he's maybe off defecating somewhere. Shows how scatology played a role in theological arguments and debasing rivals back then.
So this focus on the physical body, the statue, the human-like actions, it all leads into setting Yahweh in his original context, right? Not isolated.
Absolutely. That's a major thrust of the material. The later biblical claim, especially in Isaiah 40:55, that Yahweh is utterly unique, unlike any other god. The source says that just doesn't match the historical picture.
He was part of a bigger scene.
A much broader, ancient Southwest Asian religious world, his roles, his titles, his functions, they weren't cooked up out of nowhere.
They were familiar.
You find them earlier, attached to many different gods across the region. Yahweh was, you could say, a local version of what people expected a successful frontline deity to be and do.
So let's talk comparisons. The material mentions Inanna Ishtar.
Right, the great Mesopotamian goddess. There's this very early poem praising her immense power, her wisdom. She can destroy, create, establish order.
And mentions something striking she could do.
Yeah, it says she could even turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man. Incredible power.
And the point is,
the source points out that almost 2,000 years later, a biblical poet credits Yahweh with similar cosmic wisdom, creating, destroying. It shows how attributes of older, powerful deities got transferred, reapplied to Yahweh over time.
you also mention Inanna's descent to the underworld.
Stripped, turned into a corpse, hung up for 3 days, then revived. Dramatic stuff. Some call it a dying and rising god story.
But the source is cautious.
Yeah, the expert notes it's maybe not quite as clear-cut a dying and rising myth as, say, Baal.
Baal from Ugarit.
Right. Late Bronze Age Syria. That myth is a clearer example. Baal gets defeated, swallowed by mock death, personified as a swallower.
Swallowed. Like Jonah and the fish.
Exactly. That imagery echoes. So Baal's corpse is found, buried, and then, crucially, about 3 days later, he's restored. He comes back.
And the takeaway is that these themes were already around.
Very much so. The source argues little in the Bible is completely new compared to these older myths circulating in the same cultural area.
Okay, what about El, the head honcho god in the Levant? Where did Yahweh fit in relation to him initially?
Well, according to some very old poetry, preserved in Deuteronomy, the source calls it almost fossilized tradition.
Yeah.
It suggests Yahweh was originally one of El's sons, part of El's divine council, his household of gods.
So Yahweh wasn't always the top god, even locally.
Not according to this early layer, no. He seems to have gradually taken over El's roles, his functions. The source even suggests he theoretically overthrew his father El.
Which happens in myths, right? Younger gods taking over.
It's a classic pattern in ancient mythology, yeah. So by maybe the 9th century BCE, Yahweh is head of his own local pantheon in places like Israel and Judah. But, crucially, other gods were still worshipped alongside him, though.
And these old mythic patterns show up within biblical stories, too, like Eden.
Right. The expulsion from Eden story in Genesis 2-3, the source notes it shares key plot points with older material, like in Ezekiel, and both draw on an even older mythic template common in the region.
What's that template?
Usually involves a first human, maybe seen as a king-like figure, or sometimes a divine or semi-divine being who tries to usurp the top god, El or Yahweh. They get kicked out of the divine garden or holy mountain Eden, sent down to the underworld, and destroyed. It's a story about challenging the divine hierarchy and failing.
Got it. What about circumcision? That's a big topic. Where does the material place its origins?
It notes the origins are murky, unknown for sure. But in many indigenous pre-industrial societies, it's often linked to puberty rites, coming of age.
But in the Torah, it's for infants on the 8th day.
Right. And the source suggests that timing connects it to when firstborn animals or the first fruits of the harvest were offered to the deity.
So it's like a substitute.
It seems to function that way in the Torah context, yeah. A substitute ritual to avoid actually sacrificing your firstborn child. An apotropaic ritual harm averting, connected to Yahweh as a fertility god demanding his share, his cut of the firstborn.
This is all painting such a different early picture, this embodied, socially embedded deity compared to the later idea.
Exactly. The familiar concept of God as solitary, purely spirit, disembodied the source, argues that's a much later development.
So those explicit body parts, the physical actions, they got toned down over time.
Yes, gradually softened, even removed in some cases by the time you get to the Septuagint.
The Greek translation, right, 3rd, 2nd century BCE.
And the Targums, the Jewish Aramaic translations and commentaries, there's a growing discomfort with the raw physicality, the explicit body parts.
Why the discomfort? Theological reasons?
The source suggests it's a mix. Partly theological, yeah. Developing ideas about God being immaterial, maybe influenced by Greek philosophy in places like Alexandria, but also partly stylistic, a kind of reverence, like not saying the divine name aloud, a way of showing respect by using less direct language.
But didn't you say Jewish rabbis were still okay talking about God's body?
Yeah, interestingly, even as translations sometimes soften the language, rabbinic literature often remained quite comfortable discussing God's body, using anthropomorphic imagery in their interpretations and stories.
Okay, then there's the other big shift. Worshiping Yahweh alone. Monotheism.
Or maybe starting as monolatry. The source calls it radical pantheon reduction. This really gained traction around the 5th century BCE.
When was that again?
After the temple destruction, during and after the Babylonian exile, particularly among elite scribal groups.
And the exile was the trigger.
It seems to have been a major catalyst. These groups interpreted the disaster as Yahweh's punishment. Punishment for what? For improper worship, including, and this was key for them, worshiping other gods alongside Yahweh.
So they started to exclude the other gods from the picture.
Exactly, a deliberate downgrading. Figures who were previously part of Yahweh's divine circle got pushed out or demoted.
Like Asherah, often suggested as Yahweh's wife or consort.
Yes. The source says she was basically divorced out, reframed as just an idolatrous symbol, a pole. Other beings who maybe later show up as archangels like Gabriel or Raphael.
Yeah.
They might be demoted versions of earlier minor deities who were once part of the pantheon.
And this push for Yahweh alone worship became dominant.
It did, largely because the texts produced by these scribal groups, the ones pushing this radical reduction, eventually became the authoritative scriptures. Their view won out, textually speaking.
So it started as monolatry worshiping one, not denying others exist, and became monotheism.
That's the trajectory the source suggests. And it contrasts this with evidence from places like Elephantine Island in Egypt, where Jewish communities contemporary with these shifts were clearly still worshiping other deities alongside Yahweh. Shows it wasn't a uniform change everywhere at once.
But even with this big shift towards abstraction and monotheism, the body idea didn't totally vanish.
No, echoes persisted. The source points to later Jewish mystical traditions like Merkabah mysticism.
When was that? Much later.
Yeah, 11th, 12th century CE texts like the Shir Koma, the measure of the body. These texts discussed God's body in incredible, specific, detailed dimensions, attributes, so that comfort with divine corporeality survived in certain mystical streams.
What about Christianity? How did it handle this body-non-body tension?
Well, for Christians, the incarnation God becoming human in Jesus became central. That helped manage the tension, in a way.
How so?
The source suggests the idea of an incarnation makes a bit more sense if it's emerging from a religious background, a sort of religious DNA, that already included ideas of God having a body, maybe even links to cult statues.
But the focus was very much on Jesus having a real human body.
Absolutely. The need for Jesus's body to be fully human, to properly die and then resurrect, really necessitated that emphasis on a human form, not something purely spiritual or ethereal. And the source notes some Christian groups today, like Latter-day Saints, still have theologies where God the Father has a physical body.
Okay, we've covered the main argument about the body and the big shifts. But the source material touches on a few other really interesting points too, right?
It does, yeah. Things scholars still puzzle over, like the origin of Yahweh's name itself.
What does the source say about that?
Basically, that no one knows for sure. Scholars are still arguing. Theories mention connect it to Hebrew verbs for to blow, maybe hinting at a storm god origin.
Or verbs related to strength, striving. But the source says very few scholars now accept the traditional biblical explanation from Exodus, linking it to be, I am who I am.
And it might have been shorter originally?
Inscriptions suggest that, yeah. Maybe just Yah or Yahu initially.
And his geographical origin, where did Yahweh come from?
Again, based on old poetry, the hints point south, southern Jordan area, what's now Edom. He's described as coming from Teman, from Mount Paran, down that way.
Not from the north, like Canaan.
Seems not, according to these early texts. Some scholars propose a Midianite origin, linking to Moses' time there, but the source says the evidence for that is pretty thin.
The source material also includes some surprising skepticism about major biblical figures, doesn't it? David and Solomon.
Yes, the expert cited expresses doubts about their historicity as depicted in the Bible, these grand kings ruling a huge unified empire.
So, not real people. maybe real chiefs or local rulers, but the experts suggest their biblical stories might be more about competing traditions trying to legitimize the Jerusalem temple. Their names could even be typological, representing certain ideals or claims rather than being straightforward historical accounts.
But more confidence about Jesus.
The expert says it's more probable than improbable that a historical figure named Jesus existed and was executed.
Why more probable?
Reasons given include the fairly short time between his likely death and the first writings about him, like Paul's letters. Also, the way the Gospels seem to wrestle with the legacies of both Jesus and John the Baptist, who were apparently similar executed charismatic figures, it looks like genuine grappling with recent events.
This historical Jesus isn't the same as the later theological figure.
Right. The material stresses this historical person is not the Jesus described in early Christian writings. Things like reports of post-crucifixion encounters might reflect common ancient ways of experiencing the dead, not necessarily a physical resurrection as later understood.
And it compares Jesus to Enoch.
Yeah, suggesting Enoch, this human figure who was divinized, taken to heaven in pre-Christian Jewish traditions, might be a closer parallel to how some early followers understood Jesus. It also highlights that early Christians disagreed on when Jesus became divine. Was it at resurrection, baptism, birth? It wasn't uniform at first.
Okay. Switching to a really tough topic. Child sacrifice. The source addresses this.
It does. It states it was a reality in some ancient contexts, though what exactly child meant could vary.
Is there solid evidence?
Yes, archaeological evidence from Phoenician and Punic sites, especially in the Western Mediterranean, excavated urns with cremated remains of very young children, infants sometimes, and inscriptions use terminology similar to the biblical Molech.
And the Bible accuses King Manasseh of this.
It does. Manasseh was probably historical, but the source suggests he might have been demonized by later biblical writers, maybe partly because he had a northern name linked to traditions they disapproved of.
And Molech itself might not be a god's name.
It might be a deliberate biblical distortion, possibly of a type of sacrifice called a mulk sacrifice, which could have involved royal offspring in extreme circumstances.
Okay, one last fascinating detail from the source, Adam's rib. Or maybe not a rib.
Right. The Hebrew word selah just means side, usually translated rib.
But some argue it means something else.
Some scholars proposed penis bone, the baculum, based on the fact that many mammals have one, but humans don't. An intriguing idea.
But the expert in the source leans elsewhere.
Yeah, they think just understanding it as Adam's fleshy side made of the same clay makes more sense in the context of creation myths, where gods often tinge off bits of clay from one figure to make another. Fits the potter imagery better.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really thrown a lot of curveballs at the standard picture of God in the Bible.
It absolutely has. We've traced this journey, haven't we? From a deity understood as having a physical, maybe even muscular body.
Right, who ate, rested, maybe had kids?
Part of a whole divine family embedded in that polytheistic world.
Yeah.
All the way to a figure whose body was gradually played down, de-emphasized.
Until he became the sole focus of worship for certain groups.
And this whole transformation wasn't just, abstract theological debate. It was tied up with huge historical events, losing the temple, the exile, scribal politics, encountering new philosophies.
Right, real-world stuff driving theological change.
And here's maybe the really interesting takeaway. Thinking about God initially having this physical, social body, it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Wonder what?
How does our modern, often quite abstract, disembodied idea of God stack up against how those ancient people experienced their deity in a much more tangible, physical, relational way?
Does knowing this history change anything for you listening now? Does it shift how you think about divinity? Or even about being human and that phrase, made in God's image? Lots to ponder there.